Well, greetings, future social workers. Welcome back to Case Management 535. I am super excited for our lecture today because it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So for today's lecture, we're going to be discussing a topic called cultural humility. Now, in the process of discussing this topic, what I was really excited for is to integrate the notion of cultural humility into our case management course, because as I've said before, case management is a balance of the head and the heart. And so we've been talking a lot about the technical uses, right, of case management. We've been talking about things like terminology, need statements, strategies, and all of these things. I want to pause for a moment in this course and dive deeper into the heart arena. I want to talk about cultural humility and why it's applicable to our work as social workers. One of the things that's important to understand is that as social workers, we can come classically trained in all the competencies and areas that are required of doing great social work. But if we don't have the ability to remain humble in front of our clients, if we are quick to judge our clients, if we are slow to build relationships that are meaningful with our clients, then they won't care what it is that we know. And so there's a saying, right, that our clients need to know that we care before they care what we know. And so we're going to address this notion of the heart today in our lecture. Also, I want to say that I owe you all an apology. In the course of recording, I noticed that the past few lectures, the sound quality of some of the videos that I've shown on YouTube was not great. And so I want to say I'm really sorry about that. That's actually an error that I made. It wasn't related to YouTube or anything like that, or the videos. And so I've forgotten to click a very important button when I'm sharing the screen that allows me to share the sound quality a little bit better. So I'm going to make sure that we do that today in the lecture. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is go ahead and share my screen so that we can begin with the lecture. Okay, so as I stated before, our lecture today is on cultural humility, all right? And what we are going to do is we're going to talk about cultural humility in three aspects. What I'm going to do is discuss the theory of cultural humility, what it means to engage in a culturally humble practice. What does it mean to be a culturally humble social worker in particular? What I'm also going to do is discuss then the practice. What does it look like to engage in a culturally humble practice with our clients that we are serving? And finally, what I'm going to talk about is implementation. In a very practical sense, what do we need to walk away being prepared to do to engage in a culturally humble practice? Now, in order to do this, to illustrate this, to tie this all in, to make it relevant, what I'm going to do is tie in our biblical themes related to cultural humility, related to what it means to live lives humble and loving in accordance with Christ's teachings. And also what I'm going to do is draw on the wisdom and I think that the profound messages of Maya Angelou. I'm going to do that in particular because Maya Angelou had a significant impact on me in my undergraduate studies. I'll share a little story about that once we get rolling with some of the content from Maya Angelou. But I think that some of her messages are beautifully aligned with the notion of culture and humility. And so I'd like to share those with you today. All right. So before we talk about culture and humility, what I'd like to do is talk about culture first, okay? Many times we can bring different definitions of what culture means to us due to life experiences that we've had, previous training, discussions around culture, and all of those things. For the context of this lecture, what I'd like to do is present two definitions of culture that I believe complement one another in our discussions related to cultural humility. One is the sociological perspective related to culture, okay? In sociology, we define culture as the beliefs, behaviors, objects, and other characteristics common to the members of a particular group or society. So through culture, people and groups define themselves, conform to society's shared values, and contribute to society. So if you notice, the definition of culture from a sociological perspective has more to do with the focus on common shared beliefs and values of a group, okay? Now, in psychology in particular, sorry for that, let me get that out of the way. In psychology, cultural psychology is the study of how cultures reflect and shape the psychological processes of their members. The main tenet of cultural psychology is that the mind and culture are inseparable. So they are integrated, okay, and mutually constitutive. And what that basically means is that people are shaped by their culture, and their culture is also shaped by the individual. So if you notice, there's sort of a duality and exchange, a symbiotic exchange that goes back and forth between culture shaping the individual and vice versa. Now, I believe that there's a place for both of these definitions in the discussion of cultural humility. However, an individual is shaped by their culture, by the practices, the beliefs of a shared group. They in turn will impact other individuals who will either perpetuate that culture, those norms, those beliefs, excuse me, or what they may find themselves doing is working to dismantle certain cultural beliefs, okay? And so it's important to understand there's room for both of these definitions as it relates to culture. Now, in the past, cultural humility actually was referred to as cultural competency. And I'd like to prepare you for, as social workers, you will discover that many of you are going to experience a mandate that in your field, okay, in our field, every year we have to engage in some sort of training on cultural humility. Sometimes you are going to refer to it as cultural, or you'll hear it referred to as cultural competency or diversity training, or serving under others who are culturally diverse or different from us. And so in the past, you may have heard the term cultural competency to refer to cultural humility. You may also encounter that still in the field when you step out into your careers. What's important to understand, though, is the language is shifting. And so now what you'll hear are some agencies adopting the use of cultural humility as opposed to cultural competency. So the reason why there's a shift is because competency implies that culture can be reduced down to a mere technical skill set, that it can be developed into an expertise. And so that's a dangerous mode of thinking if a practitioner leaves a training, let's say on serving individuals from Pacific Islander descent. And now they believe that because they've attended a 4-hour training, they are now experts in understanding and working with anyone who's Filipino, or who's Samoan or Hawaiian, or whatever the case is, Tongan, right? And so we have to be careful not to understand or believe that simply because we attend a training, now we are competent in someone's culture. Culture and human beings, for that matter, are dynamic, we're fluid, we're organic. So therefore, and so many of us understand that we don't want to simply be categorized as our religion. We don't simply want to be categorized as our gender, as our sexuality, as our race, as our ethnicity, as our size or our ability. We don't simply want to be recognized as a human being for one aspect of our identity. And therefore, culture, what's important to understand is, yes, culture may be the sum of our beliefs as we relate to others in our society, okay, common characteristics and behaviors, but we're more than simply those things. And so it's important to understand that. There's a fine line as a social worker that exists between honoring someone's culture and nullifying it. And so therefore, when we talked about cultural competency in the past, what we don't want to do is clump cultures into categories based on stereotypes. We don't want to speak in absolutes when we're talking about cultures, assuming that all Hispanics do this, or all Asians do that, or no LGBTQ plus individuals do this, or no African Americans do this. We want to be careful not to summarize that simply because there may be some shared norms in a culture that everyone of that culture acts the same way, okay, or behaves the same way, or believes the same thing. All right, so under cultural humility, under the concept of how we understand, adopt, and practice cultural humility now, here's some big ideas behind it. Cultural humility is a process. It's not an end product or destination. We're never seeking to become fully competent or knowledgeable in another culture. We're seeking to learn more about that culture and about ourselves in working with that culture from a culturally humble approach. It's a list. It's not a list of do's and don'ts. It's not a list of saying that if I eat this food, if I listen to this music, if I dress this way, that I am this culture, or that someone else is that culture. All right. It's beyond simply an understanding of do's and don'ts. It's about gaining knowledge and assessing our ongoing attitudes towards individuals we serve, as well as ourselves. Many of you have heard me refer to the notion of being aware of our privilege, checking our privilege, or being aware of our internal biases. We're human beings, all right? So we've grown up with different levels of oppression and privilege. We've also been raised developing several internal biases. It's important to understand those biases. It's important to understand how they impact our work with others so that we can begin to deconstruct some of those issues within our own selves. And so being culturally humble means being willing to explore our own issues in relationship to how they impact us serving others. And finally, there's 3 critical factors that I believe are extremely important in understanding that we are to adopt a culturally humble approach as social workers. One is we have to be committed to a lifelong process of self-evaluation, reflection, and critique. We have to understand we're never a finished product, and we have to seek to continue to understand ourselves better than we did the day before. We have to desire to fix power imbalances, right? So social justice, hearts, right? The desire to correct the wrongs in society, why so many of you chose social work to begin with. You saw a problem in society that you wanted to fix. This aids to adopting a culturally humble approach. We have to develop partnerships with people or groups that are different, okay, who advocate for others. It's comfortable sometimes to stay in our bubble. It's comfortable to hang out with others that share similar opinions, similar values and beliefs. But if we never step outside of our comfort zone, all right, it's going to be harder for us to understand the perspective of others. As social workers, when we say that we're adopting a cultural, humble approach, it means we're willing not only to step out of our comfort zones, to spend time in a culture that's different from ours, but to ask questions and, more importantly, to listen to the perspective of others. And when we build an understanding of others' perspectives, we build wisdom, all right, in working with all individuals, all right? So I'd like to discuss this notion of connectedness for a moment. And the reason why is because if we were to adopt a culturally humble approach, one of the first steps we need to take is to understand that we are all connected. We may be human beings of different backgrounds. We may look different. We may sound different. We may eat different food, sing different songs, worship in different ways, but we are all still human beings. Particularly from our Christian perspective, we are all still children of God. So what's important to understand, though, is this notion of connectedness is not a new one. This has been maintained for centuries, okay, amongst multiple backgrounds, multiple cultures, where there's a belief and an honor, an emphasis placed on the fact that we are all interconnected and dependent upon one another for our success. Let me give you an example. There's a phrase in South Africa referred to as Ubuntu. Ubuntu. Ubuntu means I am because we are. Ubuntu in the larger sense means humanity. In tribal understanding of connectedness, tribes understood that an individual, a tribe, was only as strong as the individuals in it. That if individuals were unhealthy, sick, unable to hunt, unable to gather, unable to work through conflict, that the tribe, as a result of that, was weaker, okay? There's a tribal norm, a proverb that says, from the Navajo tribe, that says, always assume your guest is tired, cold, and hungry, and act accordingly. I love this particular word of wisdom, this phrase for wisdom, because one, it calls us to assume, to understand that not everyone is okay all the time. So many times we go in and out of our lives simply just asking someone, how are you doing? And what's our default response? Without even thinking, we just say, I'm okay, I'm good, I'm fine, right? And so sometimes we even ask the question of how someone's doing without even really wanting or anticipating a real response. And that's dangerous because then we fail to start to see that there's others around us that are in need. And so this proverb, what it calls us to understand is that our neighbors are going to be in need, right? It's okay to ask someone and expect a real response of how are you doing? And we have to be sensitive to the fact that maybe someone's not okay. Maybe someone in their family's sick. Maybe they're going through a tough time financially, spiritually, emotionally, right? And we have to be in tune to what our neighbors are going through. So there's that first part of it. And the second part of it addresses this notion of social responsibility. 3 words: and act accordingly. Act accordingly. Respond to the need of your neighbors. And I think this is really important to understand from a culturally humble approach, is that our neighbors will have different needs. It's not enough to just acknowledge that life sucks. Sometimes it's important to also acknowledge that we are responsible for doing something about it, okay? Finally, there's a beautiful quote by Reverend Dr. King Jr. That speaks to this notion of being interconnected, right? All I am saying is simply this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects the others indirectly. I love this verse because what Dr. King preached was, and he said this also, I can never be who I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. And you can never be who you ought to be until I am who I ought to be. he captured beautifully this notion that we are dependent upon one another for our success, for our well-being, the food that we eat, the clothing that we have, the lights that are on in our room, the air conditioning that we have, the electricity, is all because of the works of other human beings who have allowed us, all right, to reach our fullest potential. And therefore, we have a responsibility to help others reach their fullest potential, okay? So those are those themes of connectedness. Now, when we reference scripture, there's a ton of verses, okay, out there referencing the notion of humility and servanthood. I want to draw our attention to two. These two in particular have a close place in my heart, because in order to adopt a humble approach, we have to be humble ourselves in our approach. We have to understand why we're engaged in this heart for social justice and humility. Often, too, we forget that being a social worker means we got into the job to serve our clients. Sometimes as social workers, we expect our clients to do all the work. We forget the notion that we are in this job, in this career, to serve others. So there's a scripture verse from Mark chapter 10, and where Jesus defines the notion of greatness for us, right? And so Jesus shares with us, rather, whoever wishes to be great among you will be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you will be a slave to all. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for man. Wow. I mean, when he establishes that the Son of God, his role is not to come here to be served, but to serve others, that requires humility, right? To have the power of creation behind you and to say, my job here isn't for you to kneel before me. It's for me to kneel before you, sets the tone for how we are to remain a humble servants in the jobs that we are doing. Now, in servanthood, there's a scripture verse from 1 John that I think is really beautiful that defines the notion of servanthood and of love. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and truth. In deed and truth. And so I love this notion that if we are identifying as Christian social workers, if we are identifying as true servants, if we are living, saying that God's love abides in our hearts, we need to not only say it, we are called to live lives of deed and truth, to do these things, to act out. And so therefore, love is not only a set of words, it's not a feeling alone, it is a set of actions, right? It is a set of things that we can do to demonstrate our humility and love to others. So I just thought this is important to understand when we're discussing cultural humility. Finally, one last scripture verse that I would like to tie to, and I think this is probably the most significant example of how, in order to maintain a culturally humble approach, that our mentality of humility needs to match the actions that we live by every single day, okay, is this notion of faith without works. And this comes to us from James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. Let's read this really quickly, and then I'm just going to highlight a couple of things for you. In James, we learn, and the question is posited to us, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? All right, so what if these two things are separate, our faith and our works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and no one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed, and and now one of you, okay, says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them things needed for the body, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it does not have works, listen to this, is dead, right? It's not enough to say that is awful, that people are without housing. It's not enough to say, I'm sorry that you're going through a domestically violent relationship. It's not enough to say it must suck being treated differently because of the color of your skin, right? Here we are called to say, so if faith by itself does not have works, our faith is dead. It means nothing, right? But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac to the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, as he was called a friend of God. you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way. For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith from works is dead. I love this particular scripture verse because it talks about the interconnectedness of our spirituality and our lives that we live. It's not enough to say that we are a Christian, to say that we believe in Christ's teachings, to say that we want to make a difference in the world. What we learn from James is that matters not if our lives don't emulate the faith that we live. And so if we are about, you'll see this sometimes in the field, many social workers will say, well, I'm open, right? I'm open to serving individuals who are different from me. But then you see something else in their behaviors, in their words, in their thoughts, and in their actions, then their faith is dead. What's important to understand is if we are to be culturally humble in our approach, our mindset needs to be aligned with our actions, and our actions aligned with our mindset. All right, they cannot exist separately. We cannot live Hippocratic lives. All right, and that's probably the biggest challenge to all of us as human beings, right? What we think sometimes doesn't necessarily come across in how we behave. In order to be truly culturally humble, we have to be able to walk that walk. And sometimes what that means is we're going to make mistakes. We have to be willing to hear from others how we made that mistake. We have to be willing to hear from others how we can improve in our culturally humble approach. Okay. So here's what I want to do. In order to adopt a culturally humble attitude, all right, in order to link faith and works together, all right, we have to do a couple of things. We must adopt this interrelated approach when serving one another. We just have to understand we're human beings. Yeah, we're different, okay? But at the same time, we're a lot more the same than we are different. We have to address the notion that we're still interrelated. We have to know that we don't know, right? We have to know the limitations. We can't ever be culturally competent. Remember that. What works for one person's culture may not work for all. So we have to understand people are different, right? Not every Mexican eats the same food, listens to the same music, understands the same jokes, speaks the same dialect of Spanish, okay? So we have to understand that what works for one person, that works for that person, that's great. Doesn't mean it works for everyone. We want to avoid cookie cutter approaches. When we're serving children and families, we can't understand and apply a stereotype to every single individual we're serving. We must be comfortable, right? Actively seeking and incorporating feedback from our consumers or clients, and we must meet every individual where they are, right? Finally, we must consider how our words and actions will be perceived by those we serve. If we were to ask our clients at the end of our services, did our faith and our works align? What would they say about that? I mean, that's something serious to consider, right? If we identify as Christian social workers and we say at the end of this process, did you see me as a Christian social worker? Did I live out my beliefs in my work with you? It's a pretty heavy question, right? So that's why we talk about humility, right? Being able to stomach that, being not only willing to hear it, but to seek that feedback out. All right, so forms of communication. What I'm gonna do is, before we dive into these forms of communication, I'd like to show you a video from Maya Angelou. So let's back up for a second. In my undergrad, before Maya Angelou passed, I had an opportunity to hear Maya Angelou come and speak at my school, my institution. And believe it or not, I actually wasn't going to attend that talk. When Maya Angelou was coming that day, I had to work, and I was getting ready to leave the campus. I was done with my classes, and one of my sociology professors came in and said, "Antonio, are you going to the talk tonight from Maya Angelou?" I said, "No, I can't. I got to work." And I had a positive relationship with her. She had known, the circumstances of why I needed to work and everything. And she said, "Antonio, if there's ever a day that you miss of work, it's got to be this day." She says, "You cannot miss this woman coming to speak. She will profoundly change the way you see the world." Now, I had a tremendous amount of respect for this professor. And so I said, "I'll call out. I'll make this appointment." And I'm so grateful that I did, because after having the opportunity to hear Maya Angelou speak, and to learn just in a tidbit, an evening of her wisdom, I walked away forever transformed by her. So what I want to do is share some of that with you. So before we talk about forms of communication and being culturally humble, let's talk about Maya Angelou's approach and definition to what words are. So she talks about what words are. Words are things, okay? So let's hear from Maya Angelou related to this topic.
Words are things, I'm convinced. You must be careful about the words you use, or the words you allow to be used in your house. In the Old Testament, we are told in Genesis that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. That's in Genesis. Words are things. You must be careful. Careful about calling people out of their names, using racial pejoratives and sexual pejoratives and all that ignorance. Don't do that. Someday we'll be able to measure the power of words. I think they are things. I think they get on the walls. They get in your wallpaper. They get in your rugs, in your upholstery, in your clothes, and finally into you.
Okay, short video, but like I said, in Maya Angelou fashion, amazing wisdom, right? So Maya Angelou talked about this notion that words are things. Words are things. What I took from this in my 15 years of doing social work and working with clients, and what I truly hope was a culturally humble approach, is that once I say something as a social worker, I can never get that back. Whatever I say to a client, however I say it, however they interpret it, that's going to sit out there for a lifetime. Maya Angelou talked about this notion that words get into things, right? She gave that little interpretation of words getting into carpet and clothes, but she ends with the words get into us, right? Think about a time when someone called you a name that absolutely just cut at the core of who you were. It hurt you to hear that name. You know, God forbid us as social workers ever say something that would cut into one of our clients that same way. And so first off, let's consider that words are things, right? When we're communicating in a culturally humble approach, it's important to understand that everything that we say, from our speech patterns, our volume, our listening, our practice of listening or telling, our passive versus active personalities and how we speak, all right, will be interpreted by our clients. And likewise, we have to be careful how we interpret others' culture. In others' culture, it's common that speech patterns can change. I worked with a family who was Polish. I didn't know this, but the norm for that family and their communication, with how they were raised from their relatives who were from Poland, okay, from their parents who were from Poland, was that they raised their voice a lot. There wasn't any anger. They weren't threatening themselves that they were going to fight, but it was common to raise your voice and to yell. I had been raised in a household where yelling wasn't comfortable for me. I wasn't comfortable hearing yelling. And so what's important to understand is that how we perceive the words that we're using and the tone in which we communicate can vary from one culture to the other. So rather than judge, we want to understand more about that. Physical, hand gestures, body language, eye movements, whether we're sitting or standing, whether we give hugs or handshakes, that can vary from all cultures and we interpret it differently, right? We know that in other cultures, particularly like in Italy, for example, when you greet someone, you give them 2 kisses, one on each cheek. In this country, a lot of people would freak out if you came and did that to them. So what's really important to understand is that when you're interacting with others from different cultures, the culturally humble approach, you have to take this notion of saying, well, I'm not familiar with that, but let me understand why it's a cultural norm in another setting. Facial aspect, whether we're resting or when we're engaged, we want to be conscious of that. There are times where you're going to be tired as a social worker. You would have worked 8, 10, 12-hour days. You've sat in front of clients. Your facial aspect when you're resting can look like you're upset, can look like you're tired, you're checked out. And if we're not sensitive to that, what we're telling our client is we're disinterested, we don't care, we're not engaged, we're not sensitive to their needs. So it's really important to understand the facial cues that we give off. Relationship circles, we have to think about our relationships. Are most of our relationships reciprocal or are they extortive? And I use extortive in a harsh sense, but think about that. In our relationships, are we the friend that's constantly seeking for others to feed into our needs? Or are we continuously giving to others and fulfilling others, supporting others in their need? That will play out in our work relationships as well. So let's consider the origin, the basis, the core of our relationships with others. Systemic communication. So in some cultures, the notion of storytelling, songs, movies, art, film, policy that we shape, that's shaped largely by our culture. Remember that psychological definition of culture, right? Of individuals shaping culture and culture shaping the individual. This comes from that. So when families want to sit after a meal and they want to talk about stories of their families or their ancestors or their past relatives, it's not because they don't want to get to the agenda. It's not because they don't value your time. It's because this is important to them, and they're allowing you into their culture. So this is important just to understand in context. These are forms and how culture is communicated to us, okay? Now, when we move into this, I wanna talk about these few things here, and then I wanna end with another video, this particular slide from Maya Angelou, okay? So strategies to implement a culturally humble approach. There's a couple of things I want to draw us into. Let's look at this first one. First, check your privilege, right? Consider in your own mind, how does your privilege impact your ability to see, to understand marginalization outside of your comfort zone? We know that privilege can put up blinders for us. When we're privileged, we forget to see what others are going through. If I'm of a privileged race, then I forget to see how others are struggling of different races around me. If I am able-bodied and I walk to class every day, I forget to see how individuals experience getting to class if they are bound to a crutch or wheelchair, all right? And so we have to notice how privilege brings blinders up and prohibits us from experiencing, seeing the marginalization of others. To be conscious of our internal biases, right? To be aware of what words, phrases might be considered microaggressions or micro insults, all right, within your context. And so nothing can be worse than coming in with a big heart, right, and a limited vocabulary on how we address others. And I've made this mistake at times where I've been working with individuals from different backgrounds. I haven't meant to be offensive. I may have said something, though, that wasn't a preferable term for that group. I have to be humble enough for them to say, you know, Antonio, I get what you were going at. Can I give you a couple tips, right, on how to refer to this group or this dynamic? Can you use this terminology instead of this? Because we'd be more ample to hear it, okay? We have to be willing to adjust. What is our gut reaction when encountering cultures different from ours? This is an internal bias, right? So when we see someone from a different culture, maybe they're speaking a different language, they're listening to a different type of music, they're wearing different clothes. And when we see that individual, do we have a gut reaction? Do we think to ourselves, ooh, I bet that person is ... I bet that person never ... I bet that person always ... We have to be aware of what our cultural bias is, okay, when working with others, because we have to put that in check. We have to create a culture of feedback, right? Set aside time to check in with faculty, students, with your coworkers, and how your words or actions might be perceived. It's important to understand you can ask feedback, but keep it specific, right? What feedback do you have for me about that interview with that client? What feedback do you have for me about that meeting I just had? What feedback do you have for me about our working relationship and how I communicate with you? You want to be specific when seeking feedback from others, right? And then finally, do no harm, right? Be a rainbow in someone else's cloud. That's important. That's a lesson that I drew from Maya Angelou. It's be a rainbow in someone else's cloud. Let's talk about that for a second. So what I want to do is I want to show you another video, short one from Maya Angelou, on what it means to be a rainbow in someone else's cloud, and we will adopt this to a culturally
There's an
approach.
African-American song, 19th century, which is so great. It says, when it looked like the sun wasn't gonna shine anymore, God put a rainbow in the clouds. Imagine. And I've had so many rainbows in my clouds. I had a lot of clouds, but I have had so many rainbows. And one of the things I do when I step up on a stage, when I stand up to translate, when I go to teach my classes, when I go to direct a movie, I bring everyone who has ever been kind to me with me. Black, white, Asian, Spanish-speaking, Native American, gay, straight, everybody. I say, come with me. I'm going on the stage. Come with me, I need you now. Long dead, you see? So I don't ever feel I have no help. I've had rainbows in my clouds. And the thing to do, it seems to me, is to prepare yourself so that you can be a rainbow in somebody else's cloud. Somebody who may not look like you, may not call God the same name you call God, if they call God at all. You see? And may not eat the same dishes prepared the way you do, may not dance your dances or speak your language. But be a blessing to somebody. That's what I think.
Okay. I hope you found that helpful, right? May not eat the same food, may not sing the same songs, but you can still be a blessing to someone else who needs help. Ultimately, what I believe adopting a culturally humble approach is that if our clients that we're working with can see us as blessings, as rainbows in their cloud, we can overcome so many of these differences that we have with one another, right? It's all relational. It's all in concept. We are all, it's all in context. We are all interrelated. And so ultimately, our responsibility as a social worker is to be a rainbow in our clients' clouds. Our clients are filled with clouds. They're in the middle of a storm. They're looking for a rainbow. And so we can find a way to create that connection, right, through maintaining this culturally humble approach. All right. Finally, here's what I want to share is just a couple of things where we're getting to the end of our lecture here is here's what's worked for me. In the past 15 years of working with children and families and trying to maintain and adopt and implement a culturally humble approach, here's what I found has helped for me on an implementation level, right? Always start with the relationship first, always. Whether it's doing paperwork, whether it's supervision with your boss, whether it's a tough meeting with a coworker, whether it's a meeting where your stomach's turning because you're nervous about what a parent's going to say to you when you tell them some bad news, always start with relationship first. This can set the tone, right, for being a rainbow in someone else's cloud. Always ask individuals if they're comfortable sharing their values, their norms, traditions. Give them an option to pass, but also ask, what does a holiday look like in your house, right? What are some of your favorite songs? If they worship, where do you worship? What is that like, right? What are some of your norms, right? Your traditions, your values that are specific to you. You may find they're aligned with their culture. Sometimes you may find that they're not, right? If they do share, be prepared to reciprocate appropriately. Don't just demand for clients to open up to you. You're going to need to open up to them and reciprocate that relationship. Recognize that every individual family or unit may vary from a cultural norm. Just because you've met one Hispanic family doesn't mean you've met them all. Just because you've worked with one African-American mother doesn't mean all African-American mothers are going to be the same. Just because you've served one individual in a wheelchair doesn't mean you've now learned what every encounter or obstacle is like for someone that is bound to a wheelchair, okay? Seek first to understand rather than to be understood, right? Be kind and courteous. Being kind and courteous will earn you grace, will earn you forgiveness, will earn you flexibility, right? Just be kind and be courteous. Don't be afraid to apologize. Some of the most progress I've ever made with a client that I'm working with is simply to say, I'm sorry, I messed up, right? Please forgive me. This isn't going to happen again. And I've been able to move forward with so many tense moments with clients. It's one thing to say, don't be afraid to apologize. It's another thing to actually say it, right? So like I said before, sometimes you're going to actually humble yourself enough or have to humble yourself enough to say, I'm sorry. And then finally be open to feedback. The more feedback you're willing to gather from your coworkers, your friends, your clients, the better off you will be. The more you can learn from how others are perceiving you, you can begin to interact with others differently. So I highly recommend, if you do one thing to take away from this, two things actually, start with relationship and be open to feedback. Those are the two things that I would say. Everything else will come along, okay? Let's start to wrap this up. All right, I want to show you something right here. This is a picture, obviously. I want to ask you, do you know what this picture is? This is actually a very famous picture, world famous picture, in fact. I'm not sure if you know that. If you do, some of you may be very familiar with that. I'd like you for a moment to just analyze this picture. Look at the whole thing. And then kind of ask yourself what's going on with this picture. So just take like a couple of seconds, look at this picture, study it. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think this picture's of? Right? Think about if we were sitting together in class, what would you say this picture's of? Sometimes I've heard this picture's of light rays. Sometimes I've heard people say this picture is of a camera lens where someone's put their hands over it. Sometimes I've even heard people say, when you close your laptop but the camera's still on, this is what it would look like, right? So whatever that is, I'll go ahead and share with you then what this picture is. This picture, the title of this picture is called The Pale Blue Dot. The Pale Blue Dot. If you look at this particular picture, you'll notice there's darkness all around, and then there's streams of light coming down. And if you look at this particular picture right here, in the bottom, towards the middle, offset to the right side of the screen, you'll see a pale blue dot. That dot right there. That dot is our planet. That's Earth. Okay. This particular picture has a relevance to cultural humility, which I believe literally brings things into perspective. So let's talk about this pale blue dot picture for 1 second. Bear with me, we're at the end of our lecture, okay? This pale blue dot picture was taken by Voyager, okay, the telescope, okay, that was launched, the satellite telescope that was launched from Earth, okay, and the picture was taken on February 14th, 1990, okay. Voyager 1 was about 4 billion miles away and approximately 32 degrees above the elliptical plane, so a little bit higher, right, than the middle of Earth, 4 billion miles away when it was captured, okay? And so this picture was caught, okay, Earth in the center of a scattered light rays, all right, as a result of taking the picture so close to the sun. And it appears at this tiny point of light, a crescent that's only 0.12 pixels in size. So folks, this is Earth. We are actually seeing the rays of the sun because we're 4 billion miles away. We're closer to the sun at this point than Earth, and that's us right there out of the vastness of space. Now, I don't know if you're a space nerd, okay? Maybe you're not, but I want to drive this home for a second, what this means for us in cultural humility. When this photo was taken, Voyager was traveling out, and the reason it was taken at 4 billion miles was because at this point we were going to lose connectivity with the camera. So at this point we knew it was too far out, we're losing the signal from Earth, and so scientists advocated and said, can we do something here? Can we turn the satellite around? Okay, here's Earth, and we were traveling, satellite's taking a picture of everything ahead. So can we turn the satellite around and take a picture of Earth? Some folks at NASA said, no, that's a complete waste of time. How is that scientifically valid? What would we gain from taking a picture 4 billion miles away of Earth? And those scientists that were advocating for this picture said, we've went on this journey, we're 4 billion miles away. I think for a second it's scientifically valid and important in humanity that we stop for a second, turn around and see the distance that we've come. To stop and turn around in our journey and say, look at the progress that we have made. Look at how far we have come. NASA eventually approved for the satellite to be turned around, and we have this picture here, the pale blue dot. In the book written by Carl Sagan in 1997, a beautiful quote was used to describe, to put things in perspective about this picture. So I want to provide that here. This was written by Carl Sagan. Look again at that dot that's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Everything that we know about our consciousness, about our reality, about our relationships with others is here, and we're looking at it 4 billion miles away, all right? So the reason why I want to use that image for you is because ultimately I believe that we're a lot more alike than we are not alike, right? We're a lot more similar than we are different. Oftentimes we think that connecting with another human being is so difficult, right? We believe that sometimes there are so many things that we're different and that we can never connect with a human being. A flight from LAX to Ethiopia is what, 23 hours, right? And we think that that's so far away. But look at this, our entire existence, right? When we step away from the picture, 4 billion miles away, is summed up in one tiny speck. And so I think that times things aren't as complex as they may seem. I want to close this out in this lesson with one final point to drive home this fact. Ultimately, as we learned from Maya Angelou, what she said about Genesis, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And we know that we were created in God's image and likeness, right? That God breathed life into us as human beings, right? Native Americans believe that the fingerprint here, the swirls that we see on our fingertips, is actually imprint of the Creator breathing life into us. And these are the winds, the pattern of the winds, when the Creator breathed life into us. So I just thought that's an interesting analogy. We all still come from the same place. So Maya Angelou taught this notion of a philosopher named Terence, first century philosopher, all right, BC, important to understand here, not AD, BC, okay? And Terence wrote, Homo sum humani nihil a me alienum puto. And what that means is nothing human can be alien to me. Nothing human can be alien to me, okay? Interesting fact before we close out this particular lecture today is that Terence was a slave. Terence was brought to a foreign land as a slave, and when he was first engaged in servanthood as a slave, his master realized that Terence carried with him a passion for philosophy and for playwriting in particular. Terence master at this time was so impressed by Terence's intellect and passion that he eventually granted him his freedom and allowed Terence to pursue his writing and his philosophy. And so Terence spoke to this notion that nothing human can be alien to him. Now, Maya Angelou used this notion, this saying, this teaching heavily throughout her lessons. So I want to spend this last bit of time together just exploring what that means to all of us. And so let's take a look at this very last video, total of 3 minutes.
If I think of my life as a class and what I've really learned, I've learned a few things. First, I'm aware that I'm a child of God. It's such an amazing understanding to think that the it, which made fleas and mountains and rivers and stars, made me. What I pray for is humility, to know that there's something greater than I. Then I have to know that the brute, the bigot, and the batterer are all children of God, whether they know it or not. And I'm supposed to treat them accordingly. And it's hard, and I blow it all the time.
Mongrel class of people.
I'd like everybody to think of a statement by Terence. The statement is, I am a human being. Nothing human can be alien to me. If you can internalize the least portion of that, you will never be able to say of an act, a criminal act, or I couldn't do that. No matter how heinous the crime, if a human being did it, you have to say, I have in me all the components that are in her or in him. I intend to use my energies constructively as opposed to destructively. If you can do that about the negative, just think what you can do about the positive. If a human being dreams a great dream, dares to love somebody, if a human being dares to be Martin King or Mahatma Gandhi or Mother Teresa or Malcolm X, if a human being dares to be bigger than the condition into which she or he was born, it means so can you. And so you can try to stretch yourself. So you can internalize, homo sum humani nihil me alienum puto. I am a human being. Nothing human can be alien to me. That's one thing I'm learning.
All right. Listen to the humility in Maya Angelou's language, right? She ends it saying, that is something I am still learning. I'm still learning. She's engaged in that process of cultural humility, right? One of the things that I really love about this, it puts in the perspective, I am a child of God, right? Nothing human can be foreign to me. Ultimately, all of this here is created under the same God that created all of us, that our definition of understanding and everything. And so therefore, our total response, the summation, right, of who we are as human beings, it's all relative. It's not as huge or as daunting as a task to engage in someone, to give them dignity and hope that we may think, right? And so finally, what I want to do is say, thank you so much for your time. I hope that this lesson on cultural humility was useful for you. I hope that it was something that you can utilize later in your careers. Just bringing out my timer here now. And what I'm going to do is we'll go ahead and end now with a centering exercise, all right, to draw this in. So today's centering scripture verse will come from Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy and my burden light, right? So Jesus is challenging us at this point, right? Come to him. Just bring your worries, your concerns, your burdens, right? Your heavy weight to him. And he says, for I am meek and humble of heart. And if you can embrace the humility, right, that I bring, that I have within my heart, your burden will be made light, right? And our focus word for today will be restoration, restoration. So think about how God is speaking to this notion of easing your burden, right? Of making it light, of restoration. How is God speaking restoration into your heart, into your spirit, into your mind today? So let's go ahead and make sure our hands and feet are in a nice, comfortable position. Let's push out all of those worries, all those concerns about what's become before and what's coming after. And let's listen to how God is speaking restoration into our being at this moment for the next 2 minutes, okay? Excuse me. So I will keep track of the time. Go ahead and take that nice deep breath. Close your eyes and exhale. Okay, go ahead and take that nice deep breath. Open your eyes. Welcome all back. Folks, I want to say thank you. I know at this point in the term, maybe you're saying, what is going on? What did I sign up for? You can do it. Hang in there. I'm cheering for you. All right. I want to just remind you, please check Blackboard for all of your assignments and homework and all of that good stuff, so you're on top of it. Feel free to reach out to me with anything that you need. I'm always here for you. I'm excited to be able to connect with you all. Know that I'm praying for you and your success every single day. All right. Thank you so much. I wish you all the best. Take care.